Welcome to Design Talk. Next up, a recording of my presentation for the UCD Faculty Teaching Insights series held on November the 11th, 2024. Thumbnail copies of the images I refer to are included in the cover art, or watch the YouTube video version. The link is in the description. Okay, so bare facts are boring. Everyone has a story to tell. How do you make them interesting? And for those who don't know me, hello, I'm Alan Higgins. I'm a member of the Management Information Systems Group here at UCD in the Business School. We, of course, use storytelling in a whole range of areas, in particular our writing. But let's start with the obvious stuff. Stories are primordial. They're all part of our shared humanity, and we scarcely appreciate their existential character. They're so much a part of daily life. So story, or more specifically storytelling, there is no formula for creating a story, let alone a good story, but there is structure that you can employ to help the process. To write narrative requires inspiration, craft, and judgment. Stories can be spoken or written. At the moment, I'm articulating a combination of the both, but a written story is very different from its oral form. The oral form includes pauses, grammatical omissions, fillers, and much else, and requires you to think on your feet. Both, however, rely upon the fundamental storytelling structures. At its most basic, a story has a beginning, middle, and end. A three-part structure. Stories are fundamental, as I said, and researchers discover stories in the field. So this model is based on research collecting narrative stories in New York vernacular culture. You can characterize basic plots that stories adhere to so rags to riches, beginning low, ending high, tragedy, riches to rags. So these are plots and themes that you can draw on in telling stories. Another analytical approach is Campbell's hero's journey. Joseph Campbell's 1949 classic analysis of the mythic narrative structure of human storytelling through the ages. And it's broken down here as 17 stages in 3 acts. But back to the distinction between spoken and written forms, it's important because many of our stories, particularly in the university and the academy, are idiosyncratic to the special characteristics of our individual professions. Each adheres to its own genre with its own norms for the written form and also the spoken form. So without really even thinking about it, we're all embedded in our own professions, our own discipline, and we adhere to those styles. For example, in medicine, a case style or a clinical trial for the written form, research papers. In business, case studies, surveys, industry hypotheses testing style papers. Each style or genre of account has its associated research methodologies, methodological form, plus assumptions and conventions. So most, in written form at least, this is the problem, produce turgid accounts, dense language in specialist terminologies, and they're all, in a sense, addressing an audience of peers. And these accounts can be difficult to read even by experts, difficult to parse and interpret and understand. Now, each has their own style of storytelling, its own form, often unquestioned. And I think we've got better tools in the toolbox, particularly when it comes to engaging with society. So I just wanted to flag that. For teaching and learning, the audience of novices, perhaps, or for community engagement, for communicating the values and outcomes of our research, when we're dealing with society at large, the general public, for example, then we must go back to the roots of storytelling and not merely foist upon our audience our ingrained style. So one discipline in the academy, anthropology, sociology, ethnography, has taken very seriously the question of author and audience, speaker and listener. And there's a lot of writing in discourse and critical discourse studies and in ethnography on the role of story and how stories shape and create interpretations. I'd point you towards, in the field of ethnography, which is really fantastic, John Van Manen in Tales from the Field, deeply engaged with this question of who's telling the stories, what shape the stories take, and the techniques and tools we use to shape and create those stories. So Van Manen's talking about how you take the data from the field and make it sensible to your audience. And I think that an area that we must give deep thought to is also this idea of telling stories with data. So visual storytelling with data. And when I say data in this sense, I'm talking more about the numeric and quantitative data. So for all kinds of guidance on data visualization and visual explanation, I'd like to point you towards Edward Tufte, in particular his visual display of quantitative information. And he has a series of books, by the way, elaborating on his thoughts and theories of visual explanation. He states that graphical elegance is often found in simplicity of design and complexity of data. So as an example of this, narrative power for the display of data, combining information, in this case of space and time, he claims, and I tend to agree, that this is a perfectly executed example. The carte figurative that illustrates the losses in the Napoleonic army during the Russian campaign of 1812-1813. A beautiful, elegant illustration that's based on data, overlaid with a spatial and a temporal element that perfectly communicates conclusions that we can draw. As Tufte writes, this may well be the best statistical graphic ever drawn because, why? It tells a story visually, simply, and elegantly in spite of the complexity of the data. Good storytelling in data is so necessary and important because data and its metadata, measures and values and distributions, these are all opaque statistical terms and difficult to interpret or judge, and they fail to communicate well. And so here's another example, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, of a well-crafted statistical visualization acting both as an analytical instrument and as a call for action by representing the whole story of a theory of research. The Broad Street water pump. This classic visualization by John Snow illustrates and makes the argument for the waterborne contamination theory of cholera. And as a consequence, by simply removing the handle from a contaminated water pump on Broad Street in London, it contributed to stemming a cholera epidemic. The thing I look for most in terms of a teaching narrative or a narrative that has an educational purpose is a thing I would call flow. It's not what many would call flow from Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. I think I've got that pronunciation a bit murdered, but I'm looking for logic and order of conversation. So that is not necessarily stepwise ideas, a chain of ideas directly following or related to ideas. That's a cumulative model. It is one that works. Other flows, though, I would use for storytelling could be, for example, easy concepts to difficult concepts, a learning ladder, or an idea with its elaborating idea set, followed by another idea with its own elaborating idea set. You segue between the two if they're not directly cumulative or related. Or, conversational turns. So my preferred approach is a Socratic style of questioning, teaching, for teaching and learning. I would say informed by the case method, and I'd like to give a nod to Pat Gibbons, his approach to case-based workshopping, how he develops questions and prompts discussion. So, for example, for Pat, I perceive his use of question prompts to be a storytelling technique. An approach for dragging out the story from his audience of students works best if they've actually read the case, but oftentimes a lot of general knowledge is available and can be drawn into the sessions. For my own practice, when discussing ideas, I look for sequences, connections, and flow. Sequence in the classical sense of a beginning, middle, and end to the story. Connections within the story, call forwards, also call back. So these are structural links and connections, links to other sources that I drop as breadcrumbs. Ideally, also other related material that may have been presented or recorded or is available for the course for teaching. My approach is a simple 3-part structure consisting of an introduction, a series of questions, and then closing comments. The hard part is, or the art, is in asking good questions, and then in more or less logical flow, logical order or natural flow. Good questions for a class or for a guest are short, open-ended, not leading, and offer prompts for wide-ranging responses. And they're questions that encourage people to talk. They're also questions that I would think are interesting and not necessarily rhetorical questions, because we expect that people have something to offer to the conversation. And our audience consists of people with differing levels of expertise, and they'll all offer different or have different points of view. So that's an interesting place to start a conversation for learning, which is kind of the goal of a storytelling approach. So this is an example from a couple of weeks ago, actually last week. A student group, I had them prepare a debriefing presentation based on their experience using a particular technology. Their initial outline is the left-hand image, and it was good, an excellent starting point, and it captured their thoughts in advance of meeting me and for them to then go on and present. But there were too many questions to start with. For me, the ideal is around 6. I'm not showing you the full document here, but there are 6 on screen. 6 questions, I think, is enough to keep us talking for at least half an hour. But the questions themselves, overly verbose, duplicate, too long. So we workshop them down to a shorter set and then pose them in flow order, what I would call flow order. And those are the other 2 screenshots there of the whiteboard after that workshopping event. And we phrase each one with a direct questioning style of language. And then they recorded a presentation in more or less one narrative take. And as it happens, the far right shows that this kind of approach is perfect for recording for the teaching podcast, because you've got each voice on a separate track, and they've got a very, it's a clean narrative structure. It enables quick audio cleanup and edit and publication. What's missing is the preparation piece. Now, this is all preparation, but even in advance of developing a series of questions and the story structure, you do a deep dive into the subject matter. If you have a guest, it would be contacting them, meeting with them in advance, talking with them about the ideas, how their expertise overlaps between their own career specialisms and the subject you're teaching. So in these meetings, we take notes, capture ideas, and this is the background material that you craft into a narrative script. And I feel that the conversational style, the simple 3-part structure, has a good chance of engaging and keeping an audience listening to the end. So that's just my approach. I think I'll finish there.